Yes. Great. So hi, I'm Pamela. I'm a PhD candidate in English and film and media at UC Berkeley. In this talk, I hope to situate how interactive fiction games use second-person address, so you, within a broader 20th century interest in calls to you, the reader or player. I won't be attempting anything like a definitive survey here. Instead, I hope to offer a rapid-fire collection of books and interactive fiction games that explore how second-person address has and might be used to call attention to the relation between texts and their readers or players. In preparing this lightning talk, my focus tightened somewhat from the original abstract, so I'll be using Louis Althusser's theory of the Hail to explore second-person address in a few IF games, and then I'll dip into some books written in second person by roughly contemporaneous authors, namely Italo Calvino and Jamaica Kincaid. So my central argument is that these games and books adopt a self-conscious style of second-person address in order to variously call attention to the processes of hailing around us, and to rework these processes of hailing, even playfully rework them. The term hailing was coined by Althusser in 1970, a few years prior to the rise of interactive fiction. He was not thinking about games or computing at all, though. Rather, his essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, describes how institutions, so educational institutions, religious institutions, legal, political, cultural, and so on, reinforce state structures by taking people out in the world and teaching them to follow certain social scripts and adopt certain values, inscribing them as subjects of the state. This process, Althusser says, occurs through instances of hailing. He describes hailing as that very precise operation which can be imagined along the lines of the most commonplace everyday police or other hailing, "Hey, you there." Assuming that the theoretical scene I have imagined takes place in the street, the hailed individual will turn round. By this mere 180-degree... Thank you. Is this better for the over the okay? Yay! Thank you. Okay. Assuming that the theoretical scene I have imagined takes place in the street, the hailed individual will turn round. By this mere 180-degree physical conversion, he becomes a subject. Why? Because he has recognized that the hail was really addressed to him and that it was really him who was hailed and not someone else. So, very succinctly, hailing is an interactive process whereby state institutions address their people, and these people recognize themselves as being addressed. In doing so, they are written into the state's ideological, imagined systems of relations. So here are the relations between police and person on the street. It seems maybe so obvious as to be tautological to observe that this hail takes the form of second-person address. Hey, you there, even when that second-person address is merely implied. So I'm emphasizing that relation between the hail and the second-person style because I'd like to argue that when games and writing call attention to their use of second-person, they're also making apparent to the reader and player how processes of hailing work in general. Interactive fiction, which classically is built upon second-person prompts or at its very core, this becomes a crucial medium potentially for exploring how artworks in the period following Althusser grapple with their own microcosms of hailing the reader, player, or viewer. I'd like to suggest that when these games and books, either playfully or very seriously, call attention to the difference between you, the actual player or reader out there in the world, and the you that's written, they're potentially practicing our ability to distinguish between the you of a full person or individual versus the more constrained you that is hailed or written by ideological institutions. Many interactive fiction games embed this distinction between you, the player, and the written view of the player character playfully into the very narrative and medium of their games. So the opening of Adventure is, for instance, you are standing at the end of a road before a small brick building, and the opening line in Infocom's version of Zork is, you are standing in an open field west of a white house with a boarded front door. Importantly, the written you here is capacious. These openings present a player character with minimal to no identifying characteristics who can be whoever the player imagines them to be. But then more characteristics do emerge over the course of playing the game. To progress through Zork, to take sort of the classic example, the character is nudged into choices that demonstrate a zest for exploration, detail-oriented examination, and a profoundly enduring patience for trial and error. So a zeal for getting around that boarded front door. And These qualities emerge less through written description than narratively, through the player's decision-making when interfacing with the game's program. In this way, interactive fiction games and other video games create their player characters, their written views, partly out of the player's imagination and range of choices, and partly out of their pre-programmed situations. So I'd like to suggest there's a tension in the classic view of interactive fiction. On the one hand, these games offer a remarkably capacious character. On the other hand, these games rely on some narrative railroading. The player character's choices must be readable by the parser and conducive for advancing through the game's pre-programmed puzzles. In this latter sense, we might describe the player character view, maybe a bit dramatically, as being hailed in the Althusserian sense into the systems and structures of the game. Althusser stresses that hailing into ideologies works because of its seeming obviousness and unimportance. Of course they're talking to you. Similarly, the you in these games can also move between being identifiable as a particular character and also sort of disregarded, less a character and more a transparent convention that is, of course, there to move through the game's labyrinth, there to get you to the next point or action. But then again, Zork also occasionally calls attention back to its you as a full character, and its joking responses especially. When the player types in improbable commands, the game highlights the bodily capacities of what its written you can be made to do. Many interactive fiction games subsequently continue to explore how variations in second-person address can prompt the player themselves to reconsider their relation to the player character in the game. So just how we can move between understanding this view as sort of imagined, embodied character on the one hand versus transparent tool of the program on the other, second-person address can also prompt the player themselves to understand their own role as player as mediating between themselves as sort of independent person out there in the world on the one hand and part of the game on the other. To take just one way of experimenting with this relationship, Sam Barlow's Isle, Emily Short's Galatea, and John Ingold's All Roads each encourage their users to play the games through repeatedly and to attend to how their own knowledge accrues and exceeds what the you of the player character knows. So baked into their narratives is a nudge to think beyond and be more than the figure that's hailed as you by the narrative. Take Galatea, for example. The written you there will always start the story by thinking of Galatea as somewhat intriguing, yet just artificial program, regardless of what the player has learned from previous playthroughs about her self-consciousness and potential agency, or in some playthroughs, her connections not to artificial intelligence at all, but to ancient Greek gods. So the last half of my talk, I'd like to turn to a couple books that similarly play with this relation between you, the reader or player, and the written you, particularly as a way of getting at a more general relation between individual and system. The most often discussed novelistic instance of second-person address is perhaps Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. This was published in 1979, so right alongside the advent of interactive fiction. Its opening is, you are about to begin reading Italo Calvino's new novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, where the written you here in this sentence and the reader are about as aligned as you can possibly be. This written you eventually becomes specified and differentiated. This protagonist you is a man, an avid reader, and a character who keeps trying to read a coherent story but is frustrated by a series of publishing errors that lead him on an international goose chase. And at a pivotal moment early on, when the written you learns that you can't keep reading the first story you're trying to read, the protagonist gets overcome by this frustration and stops reading entirely. But the sort of real reader out there in the world, differently, carries on. In this moment, Calvino writes, you fling the book on the floor, you would hurl it out of the window, even out of the closed window, through the telephone wires, let it be reduced to electronic impulses and to flow of information, shaken by redundancies and noises, and let it be degraded into a swirling entropy. We'd like to throw it out of the house, beyond the neighborhood, beyond the city limits, beyond the state confines, beyond the regional administration, beyond the national community, beyond the common market, beyond Western culture, beyond the atmosphere, the biosphere, the stratosphere. So, it's a very dramatic passage. Calvino and interactive fiction games are, of course, not directly thinking of each other in any way, but they're both deeply invested in how people are hailed into perplexing, potentially overpowering systems. Whether this is player amid underground maze, or in this passage, a reader amid global networked chaos. One thing that their hails can do is call attention playfully or seriously to the vastness and potential absurdity of the systems into which someone might be hailed. But where the written view stops reading mid-story or dies mid-game, these texts encourage reader and player to carry on. I'd like to turn to Jamaica Kincaid's creative nonfiction book, A Small Place. This was written in the 1980s, so a bit later, and it puts a finer point on the potential political applications of this written second-person address. I'm particularly interested in understanding Kincaid as offering a searing revision of who can use the hail and to what ends. In A Small Place, Kincaid's argument is that the tourism industry in Antigua continues the racial and economic injustices of British colonial rule. She makes her case through the second person, which she uses throughout the book, a second person addressed to a white tourist and describing what this tourist sees, or rather fails to see. An exemplary passage from the opening reads, "You disembark from your plane. You go through customs. Since you are a tourist, a North American or European, to be frank, white, and not an Antiguan black returning to Antigua from Europe or North America with cardboard boxes of much-needed cheap clothes and food for relatives, you move through customs swiftly. You move through customs with ease. Your bags are not searched." So here, Kincaid calls attention to the uncomfortable proximity between you, the reader, and the you of the protagonist. She asserts that anyone, by being a tourist, adopts these mental narratives and participates in perpetuating the injustices of Antigua's tourism industry. But Kincaid's argument has force because this proximity is uneasy. Her argument is that this written you applies to you, the reader, even if it doesn't fit perfectly, even if you think it doesn't apply to you. For starters, Kincaid's narrative describes a tourist you who is white and Western, which Kincaid knew would not encompass all of her readership. Instead, what this does is prompt all her readers to confront how tourists, by virtue of becoming tourists, partake in these continued ideologies of colonialism. Literary scholar Leslie Larkin, using the language of Althusser directly, proposes, I think, really brilliantly, that Kincaid is flipping the power dynamics of the hail here. Larkin argues that Kincaid's you hails the reader into her own anti-tourism ideology, calls them into being Kincaid's tourism subject. But unlike in Althusser's account, Kincaid's criticism of the tourist works against dominant racial, economic, and social ideologies, and so reverses the conventional power dynamics of the hail. I would add that this allows us to see Kincaid not just as reversing the power dynamics of Althusser's hail, but also revising the power needed for hailing in the first place. For Althusser, the ideologies of individual institutions all work together to shore up a given state. And so the only way to break from ideology at all is through total revolution of every ideology altogether at once. Sort of in the meantime, Kincaid offers a model for how one might use the space of a book or game to temporarily, imaginatively hail a reader into an ideological account that's at odds with the entrenched dominant ideological systems out there in the world. So these books and interactive fiction games taken together variously adopt what I'm identifying as an aesthetics of interactivity. I'm using interactivity here in the way that Marie-Laure Ryan describes it as controlled freedom in her book on literature and electronic media. So this echoes Althusser's emphasis on the controlled freedom of the person turned subject. For ideology to work, he suggests, a person must freely, or at least somewhat freely, be recognizing and accepting the values of the systems they're encountering. This leaves available, it would seem, some room for that person to maneuver. So even if Althusser says ideology in general is just an eternal part of life, and we're inevitably being made into subjects all the time, there are still a range of ways people and subjects might respond to the hails that they're inevitably encountering. And so one approach we might take to studying and playing with this very eclectic group of works is to understand their experiments with interactivity as a way of widening the ways we might inhabit that controlled freedom of the hail. Thank you.